Every medieval inn claimed to have rules. Painted on signs carved into wood or shouted by the innkeeper at closing time, they promised order. Pay your bill. Keep your weapon sheathed. Respect the curfew. Do not disturb your fellow guests, but rules in a hall full of ale were fragile things. Order in a medieval inn was like smoke in the rafters. It drifted for a moment, then vanished. Travelers who could not pay their bills were stripped of cloaks, boots, even weapons. In 13th century England, records tell of guests forced into labor, mucking stables or hauling water until their debt was covered. Inns were no charities. They were businesses, and business demanded something else too: security. Yet the very walls that sheltered travelers also held the greatest threats they would face. Theft was the truest law of the inn. A coin purse left on a bench might vanish before dawn. A saddlebag stored in a corner might be rifled while its owner slept. Even a cloak hung too far from reach could be stolen, replaced with a ragged imitation. Travelers became cautious. Merchants sewed coins into hems. Pilgrims tied their purses around their necks. Companions kept watch in shifts, guarding both sleep and possessions. But the worst thieves were sometimes not guests at all. They were the innkeepers themselves. Court records from 14th century. England reveal cases where innkeepers partnered with criminals, pointing out wealthy travelers, even leaving doors unlocked for thieves in exchange for a share of the spoils. Guests might wake not only with lighter purses, but with their horses gone from the stable, their saddles already sold, and for the traveler, justice was rare. In strange towns, local courts favored residents. Unless you were a noble or a man of influence, your complaint was worth little more than your missing coin. If thieves did not rob you, fire might claim you. A medieval inn was tinder waiting for a spark. Timber beams, straw on the floor, thatched roofs overhead. Cooking fires burned from dawn to dusk. Torches and candles filled the hall with light and danger. One drunken stumble, one overturned lantern, one ember carried too far, and the entire inn could ignite within minutes. The threat was so great that many towns imposed strict fire laws. In London, the evening curfew bell signaled couvre-feu, cover your fire. All flames were to be doused, all hearths smothered. But inside the chaos of inns, these rules bent easily. The ale still flowed, the music still played, the torches still flickered. A night of song could end in screams. Fire did not care whether you were poor or noble, drunk or sober. When it came, it consumed all. Worse still was the danger you could not see. The close quarters of inns, straw beds pressed together, travelers coughing into the same smoky air, were perfect breeding grounds for disease. Fleas and lice thrived in the straw. Coughs echoed in the rafters. Illness spread in hours. During the Black Death, inns became infamous as accelerants of plague. Travelers showing symptoms could be turned away at the door, forced to sleep outside city walls. In some towns, whole inns were shuttered. Quarantine laws grew harsher. Strangers barred from entering for days until their health was judged. But by then, it was often too late. Inns sat at crossroads of commerce and pilgrimage, their guests traveling from every corner of Europe. One cough in a smoky dormitory could carry pestilence across borders. To stay at an inn was to roll the dice with fortune. Theft, fire, disease, all were risks as constant as stew and ale. And yet, travelers returned night after night, because however foul, however dangerous, the inn still offered what the road could not: walls, warmth, and the company of other souls. It was a bargain struck in every town and village across Europe. A gamble made in smoke, in laughter, and in fear. For all their perils, medieval inns endured, and the reason was simple. They were not just roofs of straw and smoke. They were crossroads, places where worlds collided. Step into an inn, and you stepped into a living map of Europe. At one table, a farmer from a nearby village muttered about harvest. At another, a merchant from Flanders counted coins. Pilgrims fresh from Santiago swapped tales with soldiers discharged from a lord's army. They came with their burdens, their goods, their secrets. But what they carried most was news. In a Europe without newspapers, inns were the press. Rumors leapt from mouth to mouth faster than any rider. A plague in Florence! A war brewing in France. A noble scandal whispered in Rome. By the time a messenger brought official word, the gossip had already traveled half a continent. Merchants relied on this. Grain prices in Bruges, wool shortages in England, new taxes in Genoa, all filtered through ale-stained benches. Business decisions worth fortunes were made on whispers carried from table to table. By the late 14th century, some inns along major routes even served as courier posts. Letters could be left, picked up, or carried by the next traveler down the road. In this way, gossip hardened into something more formal, the faint outline of a postal system. The inn was not only a hearth, it was a newsroom. Inns did more than spread information, they shaped the very paths of Europe. Before the age of detailed maps, roads were measured not in miles but in inns. A merchant planned his journey by asking, "Where can I eat? Where can I sleep?" Inns stood roughly a day's walk apart, their swinging signs guiding travelers like beacons in a wilderness of mud and forest. Entire trade routes bent to their presence. Pilgrims marching to Canterbury or Santiago counted their progress by the inns they passed. Merchants moving goods from Bruges to Venice traced a chain of inns across the continent, like stepping stones laid for commerce. Even now, centuries later, modern highways often follow the skeleton of those old routes. Hundreds of towns still carry names that echo their past: the Bell, the Crown, the Red Lion, remnants of long-vanished inns that once marked the way. For merchants, the inn was more than a bed. It was a marketplace. Storerooms locked with iron bolts protected bales of wool or sacks of spice. Weighing scales sat ready for traders to measure goods. Contracts were signed across ale-stained boards, with the innkeeper himself often called as witness. Some inns even specialized. Wool traders gathered at one, spice merchants at another. Word spread quickly. If you wanted to buy this or sell that, you went to the inn known for it, and so out of halls reeking of smoke and ale, Europe's economy grew. Inns were not refined, but they were indispensable. Town councils knew this too. Inns were watched closely. Innkeepers were often required to keep ledgers of guests, reporting names to local officials. This was partly for safety, a way to spot thieves or spies. But it became more than that, an early form of monitoring travel itself. Some cities even paid innkeepers to act as messengers, holding or forwarding letters, keeping track of who entered and who left. A traveler could be traced not by map or guard, but by the records of the inns where he supped and slept. The inn was not just a shelter. It was a register, a network, a node of authority as much as of fellowship, and perhaps most importantly, inns were where cultures mixed. Songs carried from France to England. Tales from Italy reached Germany. Recipes traveled faster by inn than by any written record. A dish one night in Florence might appear weeks later in Bruges, carried not by cookbook, but by memory. The inn was the great translator of Europe, not in parchment or ink, but in voice, in music, in food. It spread not only trade and news, but the very culture that defined a continent. To medieval travelers, the inn was never a paradise. It was a compromise. The stew might churn your stomach. The beds might crawl with lice. Your purse might vanish in the night, or your life with it, and yet the road always led back to the inn. Because the alternative was worse. Sleeping outside meant wolves in the woods, bandits on the roads, or the cold itself. The inn was a gamble, and every traveler knew it. But it was a gamble most chose to take. Over centuries, some inns grew more prosperous. Word spread of safer beds, better food, or stables that could shelter whole caravans. Merchants planned routes not only by roads, but by reputations, choosing the inn that offered security or comfort. By the 15th century, specialized inns had emerged. Pilgrim inns near shrines offered religious services. Student inns near universities provided candlelight and quiet. Merchant inns stored goods and weighed merchandise. What began as smoky timber halls slowly hardened into something more refined. Some of the oldest hotels still operating today trace their roots to those medieval beginnings. The Old Bell in England, Zum Roten Bären in Germany. The rafters once black with smoke now gleam with polish. But their foundations were laid centuries ago, when weary travelers first knocked on their doors. The inn, through trial and transformation, gave birth to hospitality itself. But their legacy was more than comfort. Inns shaped the very geography of Europe. Pilgrimage routes, Canterbury, Santiago, Rome, were measured not only by shrines but by the inns along the way. Trade routes from Bruges to Venice bent around their presence. The roads we travel today, the highways and railways that span nations, still follow paths first carved by the placements of medieval inns. Without them, the arteries of Europe's commerce and faith might have withered. The inn was not decoration, it was infrastructure, and perhaps most enduringly, inns forged connections. They were the hearth of the medieval world. where strangers became bedfellows, where gossip grew into history, where merchants forged alliances, pilgrims shared visions, and peasants learned of kingdoms they would never see. The inn was Europe's first social network. It carried news, culture, and rumor, not silently through letters or wires, but loudly in song and speech, in laughter and quarrels. Its message was always human. When we picture the Middle Ages, we imagine castles crowned in banners, cathedrals rising like stone prayers. But for the ordinary traveler, it was the inn that mattered most, a place of filth and fellowship, of stew and suspicion, of gossip and danger, a place crowned not in gold, but in smoke. The medieval inn was no palace. But without it, the road itself could not exist. The story of medieval inns is not one of comfort, but of necessity. They were rough, dangerous, sometimes deadly, but they were the bridges between villages, the lifelines of commerce, the unseen scaffolding of European society. From straw and timber, from ale and trenchers, from dice and song, grew the foundations of the modern world's travel and hospitality. Next time you check into a hotel, think back to those smoky rafters and straw beds. For the polished keys, clean sheets, and private rooms of today all trace their ancestry to the chaos, the filth, and the fellowship of the medieval inn.